Welcome to our Israel-Palestine podcast, a project by graduating high school students from Berlin-Neukölln, home to Germany's largest Palestinian diaspora, and a second home to many young Israelis. Israel and Palestine are painfully present in our district and in our schools. We've spoken with historians, legal scholars, trauma researchers, and educators, some of whom are world-leading experts to better understand this ongoing conflict. Our approach has been multi-perspectival. We don't aim to resolve controversies or contradictions, but to hear different perspectives. Human rights and international law are the foundation of responsible multi-perspectivism. Can we learn to listen and hold conflicting truths at the same time? Find your own answers, or better, questions. Are you ready for the discomfort of learning?
Hello and welcome to a new episode of our Israel-Palestine podcast, where we explore the deeper historical, legal, and political layers of the Middle East conflict. I'm Yusuf.
And I'm Efe. Thank you for joining today.
Today's episode explores the pivotal decades that defined the trajectory of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, the British Mandate for Palestine. Spanning from 1917 to 1948, this era established the legal and political groundwork for a struggle that continues to shape the region. We'll trace the arc from the Sykes-Picot Agreement to the Balfour Declaration, through the structure of the mandate system and into the Arab Revolt, examining how law, international diplomacy, and local resistance intersected to produce a landscape we're still navigating today. And to help us unpack this complex and formative period, we're truly honored and grateful to welcome our guest, Professor Victor Kattan, from the University of Nottingham. A very warm welcome, Professor Kattan. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to you.
I'll start with a brief introduction about your biography for our listeners. Professor Kattan is one of the most respected voices on the international legal history of the Middle East. He currently serves as Assistant Professor of Public International Law at University of Nottingham, where he is the Deputy Director of the Nottingham International Law and Security Center. He previously taught postgraduate and undergraduate courses at the Yale-NUS College in Singapore, NUS Law, and the Center of International Studies and Diplomacy at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. Professor Kattan is a member of the editorial board of the Asian Journal of International Law. His scholarship has been cited by the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, judges of the International Court of Justice, states and international organizations in advisory proceedings before the ICJ, special rapporteurs to the UN Human Rights Council, the Congressional Research Service, and leading academics. He has delivered invited lectures at the United Nations Trusteeship Council, Harvard Law School, and the Graduate Institute in Geneva, the United Oxford's Bonavero Institute, and the British Academy. Before teaching in Singapore for 7 years, he lived in Jerusalem, where he had been a legal advisor to the Palestinian Negotiation Affairs Department in Ramallah on secondment from the United Nations Development Programme. In the capacity, he advised the Palestinian leadership on treaty accession when it was conferred observer statehood by the UN General Assembly. He has given evidence as an expert witness before the UK House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and has appeared as an expert before the UN Human Rights Council Working Group on Rights to Development. Professor Kattan, let's start by setting the larger historical stage. Could you explain for our listeners what exactly is the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916? Who made it? What were its main terms? And how did it impact the further trajectory of Palestine?
So thank you for that question. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was a secret agreement negotiated by the French and British foreign secretaries or foreign ministers. It was secret because it sought to, if you like, divide the spoils of war in the midst of a war. So it was 1916 in the middle of the First World War. Nobody foresaw who would win that war. I mean, they must have realized that there was a high chance they were going to win it. And they envisaged that at the end of the war, they were likely to control the area that we now refer to as the Middle East. So in order to decide which powers would control which bits of areas, which parts of the Middle East, they agreed, if you like, to what they used to call spheres of influence. So they had used these kind of partition agreements before in Africa, in the South Pacific, And this was another one for the former territories of what was the Ottoman, then still the Ottoman Empire. Subsequent research has indicated that at that time, the British and the French, and the Germans for that matter, were aware that there were large quantities of oil in northern Iraq, in the area of Mosul, which had recently been discovered. And if you look at and during the Paris Peace Conference, there were large arguments about the creation of who got the spoils of the oil and how they would divide the proceeds from the oil between the French and British governments. A pipeline was subsequently constructed from Mosul to Haifa, and that line kind of followed the trajectory of the Sykes-Picot lines. So it was kind of like an old-fashioned 19th century division of spoils, carving up territory and its resources for the benefits of the colonial powers. It had a major trajectory on the Middle East because it's still it kind of indicated the borders, the eventual borders, which were slightly modified, but the main direction of those borders is can still be traced back to Sykes-Picot. With regard to Palestine itself, Palestine at that time was envisaged to be an international territory. It was colored in brown on the map accompanying the agreement. And it was envisaged that in Palestine there would be an international territorial administration of great powers who would take responsibility for administering it because it was home to the holy places.
Why did the League of Nations later accept such colonial division of Ottoman territory, even though world leaders were speaking publicly about self-determination?
Because you had at that time a clash of two world orders. You had this old world order, the 19th century world of imperialism, conquest, and annexation, and the new ideas that had emerged in different parts of the world. The language of President Wilson, who spoke of essentially self-government, of nation states, and then the language of revolution and self-determination from the Soviets, or the Communist International, from Lenin, which was a different understanding of the term self-determination. And so that kind of clashed, if you like, in 1920. Of course, the Soviets were not members of the League of Nations. They were in turmoil and revolution. They didn't join until the late 1930s. So in the 1920s, the dominant powers, which were still European powers, plus the Americans, that they didn't join in the end, and Japan, they were still thinking in the old ideas. We will carve up territory. But they said that they came up with this notion of trusteeship, of mandates. It wouldn't be the old-fashioned annexation, that in some future time they would be willing to relinquish their control over these territories, or they were very vague about how and when they would do that.
Let's get to the next foundational step. The Balfour Declaration. Can you walk us through its historical and political context in 1917? Why did Britain issue it, and what exactly was promised? How did the political promise become a legal obligation once it was incorporated into mandate for Palestine? What did it mean in terms of international law?
So a lot of questions there. I'll start with the first one on the historical and political. Well, the historical context of Balfour doesn't begin in 1917. So to understand the origins of the Balfour Declaration, you have to go down to early conversations between British imperial statesmen and leaders of the Zionist organization in the early 1900s. And we must also remember that at this moment in time, Palestine was not it was not a British territory. It was a holy land to the major religions, but it was Ottoman sovereign territory. And so the origins of the Zionist project to establish what was called a Jewish national home in Palestine is largely shaped by what is happening domestically in Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century, principally the mass migration of Jewish persons fleeing persecution from Russia and Romania and what is now Ukraine, and going into your country, Germany, into France, into the United Kingdom, and into the United States of America, where 1.5 million Jews made America the promised land, not Palestine. And as you can imagine, we've seen this in more recent times in our history. When you have a mass migration of peoples from a different culture or religion or background, social background, language, economic backgrounds, it leads to friction with the people who are living in these territories. The first thing is to bring down to batten the door, batten the hatchet, put in place immigration restrictions. And so it's around this time, this is what Europe does, this is what the Brits do. The Brits passed the Aliens Act in 1905. And the Prime Minister at the time is Balfour. They got the man behind the Balfour Declaration. So he's in Parliament saying we can't allow any more people fleeing persecution. They're being murdered, right? But we can't have any more migrants coming into the UK. And it's around this time, just prior to the Aliens Act, that the Theodor Herzl, who's one of the founding fathers of the Zionist project, makes an appearance in the UK. And he's invited to make representations to the Royal Commission on Alien Immigration. So before they pass the act, there's a commission about what to do about the mass migration, particularly into the East End of London at that time. And Theodor Herzl basically articulates his theory in The Jewish State, the book he wrote, the Judenstaat. He says that, if you encourage nationalism, inculcate nationalism amongst the immigrants fleeing persecution, and tell them their home is Palestine, then many of them will go there of their own volition. They won't want to come to the UK or Germany or France or America. They'll want to go to Palestine, the promised land, their natural birthright, their homeland. And at the time, this attracts interest and curiosity from British imperial statesmen, including the colonial secretary. And of course, they tell Herzl, well, it's a nice idea. The only problem is Palestine is not a British possession. It's Turkish, it's Ottoman. We can't promise you something we do not own. And so they looked at alternative plan, a plan called the Uganda Plan. Although it wasn't in Uganda, it was in Kenya now. And the idea was to establish a Jewish home in East Africa, the East Africa Plan. And they take it seriously. A commission goes out there to see if it's suitable for colonization. And then there's a vote in the Zionist Congress, and most people reject it because obviously there's no historical, cultural links between the Jewish people and Uganda or Kenya, East Africa. But that idea of establishing a homeland and the individuals who were involved in it. So the lawyer who drafted the plan was called David Lloyd George, who was a solicitor, a member of parliament, and who became the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in 1916, 1917. So he's a Prime Minister when the Balfour Declaration is issued. So the big change between the early 1900s and 1917 is the government changes, and you get people who are involved in these early discussions. At the same time, in November 1917, General Allenby marches into Jerusalem. So now it is a British-controlled territory. Now the plan, if you like, can be put into effect. There are all kinds of other theories that scholars have come up with as to why there was a Balfour Declaration, but the argument I've outlined for me, is at least the most persuasive. Why would the British have a policy of encouraging Jewish migration to Palestine for a 30-year period if this wasn't really the main aim? Other scholars say, the British got an imperial base in an important part of the Middle East, which they could project their empire, but the Brits could have done that without establishing a Jewish national home. They didn't have to encourage mass migration to Palestine in order to have an imperial base. They already had them all over the world anyway. So that's one of the main origin behind the issuance of the Balfour Declaration in 1917. It also served a propaganda purpose. Some scholars say it also was connected to the revolution in Russia and bringing the Americans to fight with the Allies in the war. These are probably all have some aspects of truth to them. But for me, the most persuasive one is that earlier discussions on immigration from the early 1900s involving the same people who were then behind the Balfour Declaration in 1917. Now, of course, The declaration was a policy, an instrument of policy. And it was conditional on there being nothing that would prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing, what they called non-Jewish population, the 90% Arab population, but also the political status of Jews in other countries. And why would you include a statement protecting Jewish rights in other countries unless you envisage that encouraging them to leave Europe would infringe their civil rights? Because many of them were Germans, Frenchmen, and UK citizens. You asked me also, how did the political promise become a legal obligation? It never became a legal obligation. Even though it was included in the mandate, the language was the same. It was a policy, which meant that the British could change the policy. And that is exactly what they did in 1939. In 1939, the British government said the Jewish national home has been established. We have no obligation to continue encouraging Jewish immigration to Palestine, the so-called 1939 White Paper. And so they stopped in 1939 until the end of the Second World War. They put restrictions on Jewish migration and on land sales to Jews. They said the Balfour Declaration, the aim has been achieved. It was never a binding legal obligation. It was always a promise. And you can see the colonial secretary make this very clear, not just in Parliament and the Prime Minister, but also before the League of Nations, before the Permanent Mandates Commission in as early as, I think, 1936. So in terms of international law, it was just it was not an obligation. It was a policy, but it was a question of honor. Britain had told the world that they were going to do this, and honorable states will implement what their promises, even if they are framed in and couched in vague and subjective language.
The League of Nations created the mandate system in the wake of World War I, as we were talking about. What was the official purpose of this system, especially regarding self-determination, which figures like Woodrow Wilson and Vladimir Lenin were championing at the time? How did the Palestine mandate compare to the other mandates like those in Iraq or Syria, and what was different in its structure and intent?
Thank you for that question. So the League of Nations didn't establish the mandate system. The great powers, the victors of the First World War, established the mandate system. So the mandate system appears in Article 22 of all the peace treaties, the Versailles Treaty, the Treaty of Trianon, of Sèvres, of Lausanne. And they create this new international organization. It's the brainchild of General Jan Smuts of South Africa and Woodrow Wilson. And I think what you're trying to say here is what was significant as regards the mandates is that the League of Nations created a kind of new construct, this idea of control over territory, not with the purpose of annexation, but eventual self-government. So they would administer these territories, not as sovereigns, but as temporary trustees. They would, for the good government and for the sacred trust of civilization, they would take care of these communities, of these populations, of the territories until they were ready to stand alone, i.e. become independent states. Now, self-determination, as I alluded to earlier, had different connotations. So you had Woodrow Wilson's understanding, which was basically Article 22 of the Covenant, a progressive development, evolution towards self-government. And then you had the communist Soviet understanding of self-determination as immediate independence, as a revolution. All peoples have the right to self-determination. Immediately, they don't have to wait until the colonial powers determine they are ready. They didn't like this civilizational discourse. They didn't agree with this idea that some civilizations are superior to others. In the communist doctrine, all states were created equally. They were sovereign and equal, although in theory, of course, that's not true. But the idea was that on the juridical plane, they should be treated the same. That was not the case with the Wilsonian, Anglo-Saxon, European understanding, according to which there were a hierarchy of nations. There were civilized European Christian nations on the top. Then there were less civilized countries in other parts of the world. And then there were the barbarous races right at the bottom who could never become independent and would always be destined to be ruled by the civilized states. So that was a kind of clash, the normative clash between these two competing visions, which really played out not just in the League of Nations time, but also during decolonization at the United Nations in the 1960s and 70s. Now you have a question here about the mandate and how it compared to the mandates for Iraq or Mesopotamia and Syria, or for that matter, Lebanon. There was a unique distinction. So the Palestine mandate was drafted completely differently to the others because of the Balfour Declaration. So in the other situations, the aim was to create indigenous self-governing institutions, which would become fully governing independent states in the future with regard to the indigenous native communities. In Palestine, it was a settler colonial project. They were planning to change the identity of the country from being a Palestinian, majority Muslim and Christian population to a Jewish population. So it wouldn't be a Palestinian Arab state. It would be a Jewish state in time when the majority of the population were no longer Arab, but Jewish. And the way they did that is they essentially created an authoritarian system. So in the other mandates, the Article 1 speaks of an organic law. The law is indigenous, inherent from the people who belong to the territory. In Palestine, they put all the power in the British High Commissioner. So he or she, it was always a he, could rule like a dictator. There were no checks and balances. There was no legislature ever functioned in the entire period of the mandate for various reasons, which I can go into if you want me to. It was arbitrary rule. And the indigenous Palestinian community were prohibited by the terms of the mandate and also by the terms of the Order in Council, which established the Constitution in 1922. They were prohibited from challenging the legality of the mandate. They could not challenge in the courts or in the political structures in Palestine and outside of Palestine. They were prohibited from challenging the terms of British policy. So the Balfour Declaration, although it was policy, could not be challenged by those who were subject to it. So no judicial review, no form at all. And this is also one of the reasons that led to violence on the part of the Palestinians, because they had no other way to challenge what was happening. And that's one of the main differences between the mandate systems.
Britain also had made promises to the Arab population during the war. Can you explain the significance of the Husseini-McMahon correspondence and how Palestine was or wasn't included in those wartime commitments? Was it legally binding? And how did Britain later justify, legally or politically, the exclusion of Palestine to justify its contradicting promises?
Thank you. So the Hussein-McMahon correspondence is named after the individuals who were corresponding with one another. One was Sir Henry McMahon, a senior British official in Egypt at the time. And the other was Hussein ibn Ali, who was the Amir of Mecca, of the Hijaz, which is the holiest place in Islam, but it had a kind of separate kingdom. At that time, he had established a separate kingdom, breaking away from the Ottomans, and he claimed on behalf of himself and his family and the wider Muslim nation to speak on behalf of all Arabs and Muslims. And so it began as another series of secret agreements between the British and Hussein ibn Ali to foment insurrection from within the Ottoman Empire, to undermine the Ottoman Empire from within. So it was like a military agreement. Britain would support the interests of the Amir of Mecca. In exchange, they would support the British campaign against the Ottomans. But of course, in exchange for that support, Hussein ibn Ali wanted the British to recognize an independent Arab kingdom, which would include the whole of the Arab world, the whole of what is now called the whole of Arabia, Mesopotamia, what is now Syria, sorry, not what it was, what was then called Syria and Palestine. The exception he made was Lebanon, what is now called Lebanon, because it was mainly populated by Christian communities and had long historical French interests in the Lebanon going back to, the cotton trade in the 1500s. So they were willing to exclude that part, but not the rest. And it made sense at the time because Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina were part of the caravan route. They were part of the holy places that people would pilgrim from as far as India. They would make the caravan route through these holy cities. So there was an exchange of letters, and I've read the letters as they've been translated and published, as have other scholars. And it's pretty clear that they never intended to exclude Jerusalem and the holy places. Only those parts, those vilayets of the Ottoman Empire to the west of Damascus, Homs, and Aleppo, which if you look at a map, is too far north to include Palestine and Jerusalem. It includes Lebanon and a bit above Lebanon, Latakia, up into what is now northern Syria and Turkey. In my own scholarship, I've argued that secret agreements can be binding, that there was a meeting of the minds, that they went ahead with it, and that it was a binding treaty that the Brits then unilaterally breached. Support for that view is also in the House. Support for that view was also articulated publicly in the House of Commons and the House of Lords when the documents were leaked in the early 1920s. There was a special commission established in 1938 to look into the documents following the publication of George Antonius's book, The Arab Awakening, where he was given the correspondence from the Hashemites, and he then translated it and gave the story from the Arab perspective. And this was in the media, and so they had this commission. And the British simply said, we never intended, despite what the document says, we never intended to include Palestine. However, we now know, because of records that have been declassified or disclosed in the National Archives in the UK, that behind the scenes, British civil servants, when they were discussing it amongst themselves, were like, we screwed up. Actually, an impartial observer would not agree with the government's policy. It does look like we did promise Palestine to Hussein ibn Ali, and it does look like we have now breached that. So there was a commission of inquiry that looked at these two arguments, but of course the Brits kept to their position that it was never their intention to give up Palestine to the Arabs.
During the Mandate, the empire promoted Jewish institutional development, which advanced rapidly. Could you outline which Zionist quasi-state institutions developed under the protection of the Mandate law and how that impacted the further course of things? Was there comparable Palestinian institution building or legal recognition of Palestinian national rights? If not, why?
Because the Brits suppressed them. So the Brits suppressed Palestinian national rights from the beginning. They used the Hashemites, they played the Hashemites off against the Palestinian nationalist political parties that already existed in Ottoman Palestine from the very beginning by preventing them from traveling to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. So at the Paris Peace Conference, what the British tried to do is they tried to get the Zionist leaders like Chaim Weizmann and the son of Hussein ibn Ali to an agreement. To reach an agreement, which they never did, though that's another story. But what they did, they suppressed the Palestinian nationalist movement from within Jerusalem and Jaffa and Nablus. So we have to remember that during the Ottoman period, there was actually political representation of Palestinians in the Ottoman legislature. So during the last years of the Ottoman Empire, there was a parliament in Istanbul, and there were representatives from the different parts of the empire, including hundreds of deputies from the Arab world. And Palestine was represented, I think, by at least three MPs, members of that parliament. And so, of course, when the Brits come and they just demolish that system, suddenly they're without any national representation. The Brits have imposed an authoritarian system on them, and they're like, what's going on? We used to have representation. We used to have a say in our government. Now it's been taken away from us. And so the Brits never recognized these communities. They suppressed them. They arrested them. They beat some of them up. They put them in prison. They were deported. But what they did do, interestingly, is they created the Supreme Muslim Council, which had never existed before. And they created a religious figure as like the leader of the Palestinian Muslims. And then they had the Jewish, an equivalent Jewish structure. And again, it was to play off the communities, to play them off against each other. And also they divided the Palestinian communities into religious groups, Christians, Muslims, Jews, rather than a national. They didn't want there to be a national movement where these people might work together. So they recognized them as religious communities and created institutions like that. The Zionist organization had special rights under the mandate. They had a Jewish agency, a Jewish colonial trust, a Jewish banking system, a Jewish parliament, even Jewish police force. Some of these were not envisaged under the mandate, but they took a tolerant attitude. They looked the other way, and they were able to create a state within a state. Whereas the Palestinians were not offered the equivalent. Whenever the British did so, they did offer. There were offers made to Palestinians, but they were always conditioned on not challenging the mandate, and they never recognized and parity. They never wanted to have these organizations recognizing that the Arabs were the majority. So they would be counterbalanced by Christians, British officials, and Jewish officials, so they could never actually do anything. So the Palestinian community, well, this is ridiculous. Why would we agree to an institution where we have no say, no power, no ability to make any meaningful change? So these institutions were rejected. Therefore, you had a Jewish state being created within a state, and the Palestinians were left out of this system. And when they revolted against it, they were crushed. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. We can talk about that later.
Let's turn to the Palestinian national movement during this time. What was the political landscape among Palestinians during the 1920s and the 1930s? Who were the leading factions or families, and how did internal divisions, British policy, and the legal structure of the mandate impact development or fragmentation of the national movement?
I think I've kind of answered that second question already in the previous answer. Yes, there were leading families, the Husseinis against the Nashashibis. Nashashibis were seen as more cooperative with the British authorities. The Husseinis more revolutionary and opposed to continued British rule. There were multiple Palestinian political parties. I think there were 6 at one time, from all various shades, representing all spectrums of political views, from the far left to more centre conservative views. But again, they were operating outside of the system because they were not allowed to operate inside it, and that was a big problem.
The legal regime also shaped the ground literally. How did the British immigration and land laws facilitate Zionist immigration and land acquisition during the mandate?
I mean, hugely. I already pointed out that there were laws encouraged, so it was much easier if you were a Jewish person to become a citizen of Palestine. You didn't have to live as long. I think that the period of residency was only a couple of years, whereas for others it was much longer. Again, land acquisition was facilitated, although there were restrictions placed on that, especially as the years went by. But basically, the Brits did whatever they could to facilitate the acquisition of land and the settlement of Jews in Palestine up until 1939.
Many legal historians have noted that the mandate recognized national rights only for Jews, referring to Arabs only in terms of minority rights of a non-Jewish community. What were the implications of this language in legal and political terms? How did it shape the emerging structures of sovereignty, legal access, and political exclusion?
Again, I think I've answered some of this, but the non-Jewish communities, but they were, of course, never the minority. They were the majority. But we have to remember the mandate was drafted by the Zionist organization with British officials. It was a Zionist plan. They were there, they presented the initial draft, and then the British commented on it. The same thing happened back in the Uganda plan. The initial draft was a Zionist draft, drafted with their lawyers and their officials in London. And then the Foreign Office would comment on it and suggest alternative language. That's exactly the same thing happened with the mandate. So it's not surprising that it didn't speak of Palestinian national rights, when, of course, the aim of the Zionist project was to suppress those rights and create a Jewish state.
How does the British mandate reflect a larger imperial and colonial structure? Do you think it's helpful or necessary to frame British policy in Palestine as a part of a colonial project? And if so, how does it compare to colonial practices elsewhere?
It was a colonial project. Like I said, the mandate was slightly different to other colonial projects in the sense that it envisaged that the colonial rule would end at some point, but it never said when. There was never a date when it would end. It was always up to, the discretion was always the colonial power, the mandatory power. There was a form of very light touch oversight by the Permanent Mandates Commission, which was different to colonial rule elsewhere. So every year, the British government had to report to this commission in Geneva at the Palais des Nations in the League of Nations. And it was a committee of mainly European colonial officials and experts, mostly men. There are a couple of women. I think there's at least one woman on the commission in its 30 years, whatever it was, lifespan. And they would report on all the different social indicators, the population, the economy, agriculture, laws, rule of law, education, etc., etc. So that was different, because in your kind of classical colonial, the only reporting, there probably was no reporting requirements, and the only scrutiny would have been by the House of Commons or Parliament as regards British colonies. So in this case, it was, if you like, a double form of scrutiny, because of course things could be raised in the UK Parliament, and they were. And then in addition to a so-called not neutral, but a non-British controlled body in Geneva. So that was one of the main differences. In terms of, but of course, the idea of mandates didn't die away after the end of the Second World War. It took a new incarnation, a new life form in the United Nations trusteeship model, which they then applied to some of the colonial territories in Africa and Asia after the Second World War.
There's a growing body of scholarship framing Zionism as a form of settler colonialism. The great Palestinian historian Rashid Khalidi, like Edward Said, speaks of both a national movement and a settler colonial movement. What exactly does the term settler colonialism mean? How does settler colonialism differ from other forms of empire or classical colonialism, especially given the historical existence of national rights? Is the mandate period in particular such a visible and instructive case for this framework?
So my understanding of settler colonialism is it's not just you have foreign rule, foreign domination that is extractive or is controlled for supporting trade with various parts of the world. It also involves changing the demographic structure of the society. It involves the mass migration, the mass movement of primarily European settlers into the territory, with the aim of taking it over, as we saw in Australia, in New Zealand, in North America, in Canada, also in Latin America, South Africa, although in South Africa, as you know, they're never able to become the majority. So that's a settler colonial project that was, if you like, doomed from the beginning, although it lasted such a long time. So it falls within that kind of genre of colonialism. I suppose the difference with those other cases is it was very late. The settler colonial project in Palestine began, after the First World War, when Lenin and Wilson, although very different ideological vantage points, recognized the national rights of non-European communities. And so in Palestine, you had a 90% population who were recognized by the mandate as having national rights. Article 22 is explicit about that. And then at the same time, you are encouraging this massive influx of people who are seen by the indigenous communities alien to it, with a view to creating a Jewish sovereign state. And that's the birth, if you like, of the conflict right there and then.
The Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 is often seen as a turning point. What triggered it? How was its trajectory? What were the major demands? And how did the British and Zionist group respond to it?
Thank you. Well, it began really in your country, in Germany. The massive movement of Jews fleeing persecution and going to Palestine increased dramatically in the 1930s, following the election of the Nationalist Socialists in 1933. So if you look at graphs of immigration to Palestine, you'll see that it increased threefold between 1933 and 1938. So after the Nuremberg laws, etc., there's a huge influx. And of course, the Palestinians are alarmed at the massive increase because they're coming not just to live with, they're not coming to live with the Arabs. They're coming to live apart from them. They're coming to establish a separate state where they will be the masters of the territory. At the same time, the Brits are suppressing. It's not possible for the Palestinians to use the existing political institutions, which I told you were authoritarian, to challenge that policy. There was a proposal by the High Commissioner to create a legislature in 1936, but Winston Churchill and the MPs in London vetoed it. And they said if we have a legislature which recognizes Arab majority rule, the first thing that they are going to do is to stop immigration into the country. And so they defeated the bill. So when the Palestinians realized there was no political, that they could do nothing politically or in terms of a civil rights struggle, that it got nowhere, they turned to armed struggle and revolution, targeting the Brits at that time, not the Jewish community mainly, targeting mainly the British soldiers. And so the Brits reacted extremely harshly. I think at one point there were more British soldiers in Palestine than there were anywhere else in the empire for a country the size of Wales, which was a tiny place. I think there were over 100,000 British soldiers, multiple divisions, an air force. They were bombing the Palestinian rebels from the sky. They were tortured. They were put in metal cages. They were starved in sunlight. They were subject to what we now call waterboarding. They had, there were most atrocious kind of crimes were committed by the Brits during this period, well documented. At the same time, the Brits were struggling to suppress this revolt, which lasted for 3 years. And they then started to train some of the Jewish settler communities, they gave them paramilitary training. So they trained them subversion, they created night squads, they armed them. And this is important because those individuals who were trained, special forces trained by the Brits, then became part of the Palmach and the Haganah after 1948, like Moshe Dayan and others. They were all trained by the British in the 1930s. So this is one of the reasons why in 1948 the Palestinians were hopeless, because all the leaders were killed, they were imprisoned, they were exiled, they had no army, but the Jewish community had been trained for about 10, 15 years by the Brits. And but I'm going on a sidetrack there. But that's why the Arab Revolt is such an important turning point. So although at the end of the Arab Revolt, the British did change their policy, they did abandon the Balfour Declaration, already the foundations of the Jewish state had been established, and they had everything they needed, and they were also trained by the best at the time, by British special forces, British troops. Aircraft as well was used, as I said. And in 1936, they were also using emergency. They were using this for what we call the Defense Emergency Regulations, which, by the way, are still in force. The Israelis today still use the Defense Emergency Regulations to destroy Palestinian homes in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. But they only use it against Palestinians. It's never been used against, since the State of Israel was established, against Jewish communities. And it was actually explicitly mentioned in the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion last year. But what's important is that these Defense Emergency Regulations dismantled any semblance of civil society. They vested all power in the military commanders to do whatever they pleased to suppress the revolt. Anyone who was killed or anyone who was imprisoned could not appeal to an independent court. They ended all the appeals process during the revolt. They were court-martialed in inside police stations. Police stations were turned into courts. There were ouster clauses saying, you cannot challenge the legal basis for for being interned, whether in the UK courts or in British courts. So they created this very extreme authoritarian system, what some scholars have called rule by law, not rule of law. And I would argue that all this is what was inherited, what the state of Israel inherited when they came, when it was established in 1948. A very powerful matrix and form of control, which they perfected and applied to the Arab community inside Israel, in the Triangle and the other Arab areas, from 1948 to 1967, or 1966, and then after 1967 to the Palestinians until today. You can trace that legal lineage, those laws, those practices, all the way back to British policies and laws in the 1930s.
Which significance does it have for Palestinian collective memory? How do you think it shaped national identity, both in terms of resistance and in terms of British repression?
You mean the Arab Revolt?
Yes.
Specifically. I mean, it is a long time ago, so it had a huge impact on the memory of my grandfather's generation, for example, for people who lived through it. But I think less so today. I mean, especially what's happening in Gaza now. People are not thinking about what happened in the 1930s. But yes, it did have it did shape Palestinian national politics, as did the Nakba in 1948 and the 1967 war and other wars that have happened subsequently. But many of the Palestinian leaders who were suppressed in the 19th, some of them went on to form the nuclei, the center of the Palestinian national movement that emerged after 1948 and then became the backbone of the PLO. But I would say the PLO in the 1960s was mainly formed by the refugees from 1948. So again, it would have been their parents' generation that were largely influenced, but they would have been familiar with the stories of the revolt and influenced by it.
Looking back, was there ever a legal or diplomatic moment between 1917 and 1939 when the trajectory could have changed?
Yes, there was. 1922 and 1923 and 1924, there were moments when the British actually thought of abandoning the entire project. So they had very serious discussions internally as to whether, because there was always opposition to British, within Britain, there was always opposition to this policy because it was sheer madness. A lot of people recognize that. Whether it was Lord Curzon, who was voted against the Balfour Declaration, a member of the War Cabinet, a former Viceroy of India in 1917, or whether it was during the discussions with the League of Nations in 1922. There was, again, opposition in the House of Lords who voted against the mandate. Whether it was internal discussions amongst Foreign Office elites saying, are you sure you want to press ahead with this? There's going to be problems. We've had revolts. We had problems with day one with this conflict. But British prestige and honor is what won the day. And you can actually see that in the argument. It would be dishonorable for us to reverse course. We must pursue relentlessly what we have told the world we are going to do. So there were moments when the diplomatic trajectory could have changed. There were later moments as well. But I suppose the sheer inertia of doing what one has set out to do is what prevailed in the end.
In closing, what is the most important and impactful aspect of the mandate period everybody should know about and remember when speaking about the history of the conflict?
Well, gosh, there's so many. I mean, a period I always felt was interesting. Well, there are many, but I guess is not so well known is the massive opposition to the mandate, even within the League of Nations in the early 1920s. The French were against it. The Italians were against it. The Holy See, the Vatican, even issued even formally objected to the mandate system. They wrote directly to the Prime Minister Lloyd George saying, "How can you pursue this policy? It will directly violate Article 22 of the Covenants of the League of Nations, which recognizes the national rights of the Palestinians, but here you're privileging an external community who's going to have more rights than the indigenous population." And what's really interesting is that the Vatican, the Holy See, Cardinal Gaspari was his name. He wasn't just speaking for the Catholics not even for the Christians. He was speaking on behalf of all Palestinians, including the Muslims. He said they are all against this policy. But legally, how can you pursue it? And the British government actually went so far as publishing a command paper, an official parliamentary paper, publishing it, saying that they never intended to subject the native population to the domination of another. And yet this is exactly what they did. So that's one important moment. There are others one could mention, such as partition, but I think these are more well known to your listeners.
Well, that being said, this marks the end of our podcast. Thank you so much, Professor Kattan, for taking the time and sharing your wisdom with us. It's been an honor.
It's a pleasure.
I only can agree. It's what one.
Thank you for reaching out.
Thank you for listening. If this conversation was meaningful or unsettling, if it left you with answers or more questions, feel free to like, share and subscribe. See you next time on our Israel-Palestine podcast.